A young family discovers a pet cemetery and burial ground next to their new house, one that has the strange ability to bring dead animals back to life, albeit never quite the same. But this begs the question, could a person be brought back as well? Hello and welcome back to Fatal Film, a watch-along horror movie video series where every 2 weeks I give you guys a horror movie and then we sit down and we talk about it. This week we watched the 1989 cult classic, Pet Sematary. My god, this movie. Before we get into it, never judge a book by its cover. This movie's called Pet Sematary. I don't really know what I was expecting, Is it about some spooky cats? I'm not really sure. I watched a little trailer and I'm just like, oh, this will be interesting. I've heard of this movie a lot. But I had no idea what I was getting myself into. I was not expecting some of the gross out kind of scenes. There is a lot of cool, interesting moments in this film that I was not expecting whatsoever. It really did exceed my expectations. So, let's get into it. The movie starts off with a young couple, Lewis and Rachel, and their 2 young kids, moving into a new town and a new house, and Lewis is starting a new job that, they're paying for his house and stuff like that. It's always like a sketchy thing, and it's a little bit of a trope. It's like this small town brings in this unaware, kind of unsuspecting young couple to move into this house, and they hook them up with this great place and all this kind of shit. But of course, there's always a catch. They quickly get acquainted with their new neighbor, Judd, who's played by Fred Munster himself. After he saves their kid from getting run down by the semi-truck. Look, one thing about this property is it's located on this ridiculous road that all of these 18-wheelers, they're just hauling ass down this road fucking all the time. And there's so much foreshadowing. It's like one of these kids are gonna be roadkill. 100%. Might not happen today, but it's happening. And Judd explains that because of all of the trucks in the area, a lot of the previous owners' pets have died, which is the reason for the pet cemetery, which is just down off this path coming from their new property. So Lewis, who's a doctor and teaches at one of the schools in town, ends up being haunted by a guy who got hit by a car at the school and ended up dying under his care. It's a really shocking and jarring scene. It really goes from 0 to 100 because up until this point in the film, there hasn't been any gore, there hasn't been any scares, any kind of violence, anything like that. And then there's a scene transition and this dude's head is just fucking split open, his brains are exposed. It's all practical effects and it looks absolutely disgusting, and that's what makes it so jarring because you're not expecting it. It's just a scene transition, boom, brains. It's holy shit. And this guy's name was Victor Pascow, and he ends up being a kind of important character because he ends up communicating with the family, particularly Lewis at the beginning here, and he's kind of like a friendly ghost, I guess, because he's basically trying to warn Lewis and warn him of the pet cemetery and just advise him there are some lines that just aren't meant to be crossed. So after his daughter's pet dies, Judd takes Lewis to bury the cat at a special burial ground just beyond the pet cemetery, knowing that the cat will come back to life. And to Lewis's amazement, the cat, good old Winston Churchill, does come back to life. Just a little bit more crazy, a little bit more aggressive than before. And goddamn, man, I'm telling you, this cat was cracking me up this entire movie. Because this cat is was he an evil cat? I don't know, man. He was just a little bit of an asshole, and he was just so hyper aggressive, and he was just meowing and growling. And to be honest, I thought it was funny. I was cracking up at this cat because he was such a little asshole. Any cat owner, I think, can kind of relate. If your cat's kind of just acting like an asshole. But then disaster strikes. We all knew it was going to happen. 100%. At some point in the film, one of these kids gonna get hit by a truck. And sure enough, man, this scene was so stressful because this truck, you could see it coming from a mile away, and they're really dragging this shit out. They're really selling you on this death. The family's in the park flying a kite, and of course they turn their back on Gage, the youngest son. He's 2 years old, and he loses control of his kite, and he runs off into the street, and it's too late. Gage ends up getting hit by the truck. This was a super stressful scene, a super stressful couple scenes. The family's obviously grieving really hard, and then it jumps over to the funeral, and this funeral scene was so fucking ridiculous. Can we talk about this goddamn funeral scene? So it's kind of hinted at that Lewis doesn't really get along with Rachel's family, his wife. Doesn't get along with her family, doesn't go to any of the family events or anything like that. And then at the funeral, you kind of understand why. Because her dad is an asshole. He's up there grieving the death of his son, and the dad, his father-in-law, comes over and he punches him in the face. He's like, "Where were you?" He's like, "Who acts like this? Who does this to anybody at a funeral. It's so ridiculous. It's so over the top. It's so dumb. But I love it. That's kind of the movie in a nutshell, though, man. It's so over the top, so gratuitous, so extra. But then, of course, the thought crosses Lewis's mind. He was able to bring back Church, good old Winston Churchill the cat. Could he possibly bring back his dead son, Gage? And Judd, the neighbor, he 100% calls it. He's like, don't you even think about doing it. Don't think about doing it, because he's been down that path before. So then there's a flashback sequence where Judd tells the story of when they brought back a person before who had died. And he came back, but he was basically like a monster. It was crazy. But of course, that's not going to stop the grieving parent, Lewis. He digs up the grave and takes the body up to the burial ground. And Judd, man, this was so stressful as well, because Judd was basically watching the path to the pet cemetery, because he knew that Lewis was going to go and try to bring back his son. So he's there, he's got a 6-pack of beer, and he's just watching the path, and he's waiting. But this motherfucker falls asleep. And so Lewis just walks right on by and goes up the path and buries his son in the forbidden burial ground. And then sure enough, he comes back. He comes back and he goes after Judd. Poor Judd, man. He was the one who called it from the beginning. He warned Lewis, don't do it. He was just minding his own business, trying to do the right thing. So then Rachel comes back. She was staying with her parents. She comes back and she ends up getting killed by Gage as well. So now it's up to Lewis to stop the monster that he's basically created. And you know, this movie really is like a descent into madness for Lewis, because he really, by the time he goes up and digs Gage's grave, he really is kind of crazy. Of course, he's overcome by grief. He lost his son. The thing that's kind of funny is like, okay, maybe they come back to life with a little bit of extra strength or something like that. They got zombie strength. But goddamn, this kid is 2 years old. He's in the body of a 2-year-old. How strong can he be? But Lewis ends up killing him with an injection, and then discovers the body of his dead wife. He's really over the edge at this point. He's crazy. And he does one of the most frustrating things I've ever seen in a movie. He goes and he buries fucking Rachel at the burial ground. And his logic is, oh, I must have waited too long to bring back Gage, because, you know, he started to decompose a little bit, so he was all zombified and gross and crazy when he came back. Maybe because she just died, maybe if I go and bury her now, she'll come back and she'll be normal. But no. And it really is like a shocker ending, because Lewis is sitting there at the kitchen table and Rachel walks in looking just disgusting looking. But Lewis, he doesn't give a shit. He's crazy at this point. And they get up and they kiss, and then she kills him. Roll credits. Holy shit, and she's spewing stuff out of her face. What a crazy movie. This movie was a roller coaster ride. I really wasn't expecting this at all. So that's pretty much it for like the main plot of the film, and there are some other subplots as well. Hands down, the most disturbing subplot in the entire film, the entire movie, was Rachel's sister, Zelda. So there's a scene where Rachel is telling Lewis about the story of her now dead sister Zelda, and how she was really sick and she had this issue with her spine and it caused her to be bedridden, and she really kind of became deformed and really gross looking, and the family got tired of taking care of her and they're basically just waiting for her to die at this point. It's really sad, it's really disturbing, but then they give you this flashback sequence, and my god, Zelda was one of the most terrifying beings on the planet. She was so scary. They really make her out to be this really kind of monstrous figure. And possibly because it was through the eyes of an 8-year-old kid, 8-year-old Rachel, in the flashback, that made her look that much more disturbing, because that's how she remembered her sister looking. And goddamn, this was hard to watch. And I was eating watching this movie, and I was like, oh man, this shit is rough, dude. Zelda was hands down the scariest thing in the film.
Out of bed again! Never get out of bed again! Never get out of bed again!
This movie had a big emphasis on these gross out scenes. The biker's brains hanging out, you know, Zelda, Rachel coming in at the end, Judd's face getting ripped apart. There was a lot of crazy, gross out practical effects in this movie that were very, very effective. Especially because going into this film, I was expecting this movie to be about some spooky pets, some spooky cats. But I was really unprepared for a lot of these gross out scenes. And I really liked this movie. I definitely understand why it has the cult status that it has. I don't think this movie was, super critically praised when it first came out, but it's one that audiences have really attached themselves to over the years, and it's really got that cult status now, which is why it's getting this remake coming up very soon. I think the pacing of the film was really good. It's got some likable characters. I really did like Judd's character, Fred Munster. And despite some of the plot points being easy to predict because of some real intense foreshadowing, once Gage actually came back, things really got off the rails, and I had no idea what to expect after that. I think this was a really fun horror movie, and I would definitely watch it again, and I absolutely recommend people check it out before the remake comes out. I give this movie like an 8 out of 10. Anyways, that is going to be it for my review of the 1989 cult classic Pet Sematary, and for next episode of Fatal Film, we're going to take it back to Japan like a true weeb, and we're going to watch the 2002 Japanese horror film Ju-on: The Grudge. Now, a couple episodes ago, we watched the Japanese horror film The Ring, and now we're going to be watching The Grudge, and eventually, these two worlds will collide, and we're going to watch, eventually, Sadako versus Kayako. But first, we need to get these two films out of the way to really lay the groundwork. So, for next episode, it's going to be The Grudge. Thank you guys so much for watching. Peace out.